Now, of course, we know in regard to feminism here in the West, there's been a war against the nuclear family, most particularly in the Black community, which in many ways came to a head with Black Lives Matter on their website. And they talked about the disruption and the diminishing of the nuclear family, which in essence really meant men, because they had no problem with women-led families. They had no problem with multiple women leading families, married women, so on and so forth. The only thing they really meant was diminishing the presence of men in the family in terms of what was regarded as family in and of itself. Now, they've since removed that statement from their website, but we talked about it on this channel and in this space for quite a while before they did. But I found the contrast interesting, and it raised a lot of debate. And of course, you had a lot of people saying, well, it doesn't matter. You know, I think her standing on her own is a statement of power, right? So we got Rihanna with her man and her child. And even down to the body posture with this image, in contrast to the image in the statue in Senegal, highlighted for us. The idea was to lionize Black women as heads of family, even to the degree where their body posture, hers being masculine and leading, is being effeminate, holding the child. And of course, if you call it effeminate, there are all kinds of questions about to what extent you're a misogynist. And this is, in other words, you have to accept this silently or else there's something wrong with you. So if you put this in kind of chronological alignment and contrast to Senegal, the idea you have between these two images is that one, you need to first celebrate the feminization of men. And then by the time you get to Thomas Price, 2025, New York, the absence. And this is what's considered acceptable. This is what is considered ideal. Why? Because it foregrounds women. What it reminded me of was 2020. The image of Rolling Stone's cover and on Time's cover, right? Lionizing Black women. Now, obviously, in one of these images, the Rolling Stone one most particularly, you don't see very many men at all, but you do see children, Black male children. Now, this is acceptable from the same ideological standpoint. This is really the only acceptable male presence, is child. And it's acceptable until he reaches adulthood. And then you have absence. So when I first saw the statue in New York, this is actually what I thought of first. An ongoing project to downgrade and make invisible the Black male presence. We are all going back and forth about what it means, how we should receive it, how we should interpret it. The way I look at it is that it is part of a trope, part of a tradition of Black feminist media that proposes the lionization of Black women, that relies fundamentally on white liberal subsidization, because white liberals love this as much as Black women do, at least in terms of what they say is regarding aesthetics publicly and what they're willing to fund, right? So you got the lionization of Black women, you got the appeal to the white liberal dollar, white liberal interest, and we have the absence of Black men. When people ask me, what do you see when you see this? I see an ongoing agenda to downplay and eliminate and make invisible Black men. And I see it being reinforced in terms of empirical data in regard to our access to power. Playing by these rules doesn't work. We have to play by a whole different set of rules. So while we're seeing this lionization take place, the other thing that I noticed happening, especially in regard to the unemployment rate, was Black women are starting to experience life as Black men. No safety nets, no grant research, no welfare benefits. And if anything, because of years of putting Black men down for not going to college to the same degree that they are now, Trump pushing for the return to student loan payments to the degree where you might be garnished as of May 5th. Black women are starting to experience life much the way Black men have. No expectation of a safety net. And this is something that you're struggling with. But it's just started. So, we got a long way to go to see where this goes and to what extent. But at the end of the day, these are the things that I thought about when I saw this image. Although they love the pedestalization, don't get me wrong. But it's also supposed to translate to some degree of power. And it has to some extent. The things that are being taken away now were things that were given in the first place. These were things that Black women were coerced seduced to participate in, going as far back as, well, we can take it back earlier, but let's start with the late 1960s. The rise and mainstreaming of feminism, right? They courted black women and offered them baubles. They offered them gifts. They offered them access via white women, via white liberal women, most particularly, access to resources that black men couldn't get. And the cost of that access was stepping away from black men. And black women shot across the bow first, because the agreement they made with white feminists in particular, you can have access to these resources as long as you cut them niggas out. Cut them out of families, and then turn around and call them deadbeat dads. Right? So the narrative we've had for the last few decades as to what the state of the black family is because deadbeat dads, or just leave. But we ignore the fact that they actually have access to resources via family court and even the police departments to push men out. That never gets discussed, because another aspect of what they benefit from is media-based. The narrative of what's happened in the black community, black women have had greater access to, as far as what is the mainstream considers the problem with the black family. I don't know how possible that is, especially when you look at what the younger generations of men are doing. But that said, it definitely isn't going to happen without an acknowledgement of the last 50 years. And there's been none. The gaslighting that's going on, right? Because even when you look at the concept of black girl magic, it doesn't acknowledge policy. It doesn't acknowledge access. It doesn't acknowledge what black women were able to benefit from that black men weren't. It acknowledges none of that. Reconciliation with black men, they're starting to push for it, but without having to acknowledge fault, without having to acknowledge past actions. The only fault that can be acknowledged are black men. We got to be the ones that are responsible. We're the deadbeat dads. We chase white women too much. I mean, you name it. There's all kinds of faults that black men have been accused of for the last few decades. But collectively, or in significant numbers, we've not seen black women acknowledge not only what they've done, not the Faustian bargain or anything since. They've not acknowledged that, nor have they acknowledged the gaslighting that they participated in by telling black men that the piss that's on our heads is rain. That's basically what they've been telling us. That the resources they had access to were just a product of their brilliance. And the fact that black men had no access was just because we were lazy. I mean, these are the same kind of stereotypical concepts that we heard from racist white folk. And Tommy Curry already showed how black feminists use much of that same research to articulate their works in regard to how they positioned and framed black men. They actually used white racist scholarship to do so. We're seeing the same thing in the public discourse, where for years we were monsters, abusers, rapists, deadbeat dads. And instead of acknowledging and apologizing for that gaslighting, instead what we get is, well, it's just time for the black family to come together. Word. That's how you approach that? You ask me what I see when I see this image. I see a dying idea. An idea that's been propped up by policy for decades, and that policy has now begun to turn against them. Those safety nets have been removed. I'm not jumping in the aisles, but I'm not walking the hallways crying either. I and many black men like me are desensitized to much of this. Black community is going to change in tone and presence in a lot of ways. And it's already in motion. Before Passport Bros became a mainstream thing, already in motion. And this kind of shit contributes to it. But what is being presented as a harmless, artistic statue is far more than that. And black men aren't standing for it anymore. And you can call us whatever you want to in public, but we have our own circles to reinforce what we study, what we come to, and what conclusions we reach. That's not dependent on mainstream approval. That's one of the things I got to say about both the Black Manosphere and Black Male Studies. As I redefine the black family as a family with a black male at its head, regardless of the race of the wife. And that's what I mean when I say the black community is changing in tone and presence. It's irrevocable at this point. Florida, Brooklyn, BK for life. Became a YouTube member. Appreciate that. Welcome to the Onyx Brotherhood. Shout out to Original Man for that donation. Appreciate that. Says absolutely. They are so tone deaf to the differences. It's easier for them to just say it's our fault. The men in my family have taken longer to develop, and I had to explain this to my sister. Yeah, it's a different relationship. When you listen to black men talk about traveling the world looking for everything from sex to marriage, they're going everywhere. Brazil, the Caribbean, they're going to the DR, they're going to, Thailand, they're going to the Philippines, they're going to Africa, right? But if you leave it to black feminists to frame for you what black men are doing, they just want white women, which has been the ongoing kind of critique of black male sexual interest for the last, going back to slavery. The idea is that black men just want white women. But you really don't hear about black men going to European countries in any large numbers looking for women. They're going everywhere else in the world. And most of which, they tend to still entertain black women. They just tend to be black women from different countries. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but as far as I can see, it seems to me like the majority of black men still want women that mirror them in some kind of way, contrary to popular opinion in the mainstream or amongst black women. Anyway, all right. So it was a brother who was actually telling a story about going to see an older family member who was a light-skinned older woman in his family. And he was a boy under 10 years old. His parents left him to stay with her for a couple of days or whatnot. And because he was darker skinned, she made him eat outside with the dogs at a family event that his mother wasn't at, apparently. So, and he did a fine job telling the story, but it looks like they pulled it down. And I wanted you guys to really see that. Well, I apologize. But anyway, that said, this whole idea of colorism, they like to act like black men haven't experienced. Since Trump's election, what we've actually seen in regard to the black gynocracy is the ejection of black women from positions of status. A demotion, if you will. A demotion that is taking many different structural forms that we've taken for granted for years, because for most of our lifetime, this is what black women have had greater access to, more than we have, right? April jobs report, black women lost 106,000 extra jobs, most among all workers. Now, one of the things that we could always rely on in the black community is that black women had greater access to employment. Black men's unemployment rates were always higher than most particularly black women. So we knew it wasn't just a racial issue. We knew it was also a gendered issue, right? So for March, black men were at 6.1, black women were at 5.1. In April, black men are at 5.6. And for the first time, we see black women shoot past black men at 6.1. Now, granted, these are dealing with months. So we're going to need to look at this on a longitudinal basis over time and see what the long-term term effects are. But what we can tell is that when it comes to unemployment, at least for this given moment, loss of over 100,000 jobs in a very short period of time has had an impact. Right? So this is the reality. So we got the lionization of black women happening in terms of media, and this has been going on for the last number of years. The absencing of men and the male presence altogether. But since we've had this conservative push into office, this removal of DEI practices and other things we're going to talk about in a moment, we're seeing this kind of social demotion taking place. Now, I did a show a couple months ago highlighting how many high-profile black women in really high-level positions were being publicly removed, being caught doing illegal things. I take that with a grain of salt because there's a lot of people doing illegal things in high-level positions. But who gets caught? Who goes to jail is a whole different conversation. It's not necessarily about guilt or innocence. It's about who's even being pointed to in public, who's being identified as somebody doing something problematic or illegal. And in this last few months, we've seen a record number of high-profile black women being called out publicly, right? But now we're seeing it shift into areas of unemployment, right? So again, this is only dealing with monthly data, but as we go forward, it's going to be interesting to see what happens from there. So that's one thing, right? We also have this happening in terms of, the removal of particular grants, right? Grants that we've known for years were earmarked for special, demographics, often demographics that didn't include black males. I was talking to a brother of mine earlier today, and he was telling me in his area, he's an artist. And one of the areas that, one of the things he's known in his artistic community is for the last couple decades, that they were often, they would often get grants and start nonprofits and 501c3s and be able to establish themselves along those lines. And he said there was a clear marked line between black women and black men in terms of access to these resources. They were overwhelmingly targeted at black women. Black males, for the most part, couldn't get many of them. You had an occasional brother that could for one reason or another, but for the most part, there was almost a silent gender line over who had access to these resources. And as we know, over the last year, and it's even culminated in a lawsuit, those resources have been put into serious question. And so you have a lot of people in the nonprofit and the artistic community that have found that these grants that they've relied on for decades, in some cases, have disappeared.